Let me thank Larry Dansinger. Larry has certainly been one of the leading nonviolent change activists in the state of Maine. And Larry has arranged this great visit to Maine by Cheri Honkala. And I passed around the sheet with her other, a lot of her other appearances in Maine. So I just want to mention, some of you may like to go tomorrow evening. It's going to be a great program sponsored by Food and Medicine from 6 to 9, includes, I think, a potluck. And it's going to be at the Labor Council building, 20 Ivor Street in Brewer. So you might like to take that in. I might mention also Eric Olson is recording the program, and what he does is he makes podcasts under peacecast.us. And so this, the program today will be available on the internet. So if you know people who missed today's program, they'll be able to access it in the future. So let me just say, Larry is going to give the introduction. So let me just say it's great to have Cheri Honkala here. I'm really excited about this visit. I was just thinking, I'll say one line. I was just thinking in the debates, remember when McCain and Obama were asked the question whether health care was a right or a privilege? And McCain flubbed it. He just didn't know what to say because his honest answer would not have gotten many votes. And Obama came right out and said it's a right. And this was supposed to be a big plus. But we have this huge gap between change rhetoric and reality, where in fact we don't have health care or other economic human rights. And this is one of the most important issues for me. We've always been proud of that we stand for freedom and human rights, but we've never in the history of the country included economic human rights. So I think this is really crucial, and I'm delighted because Cheri Honkala not only addresses this, but she's an activist. She's a person who's dedicated her whole life to bringing about economic human rights for all of us. So I'll turn the program over to Larry and let him give the introduction.
I'm Larry Dansinger. I work with a group called Resources for Organizing and Social Change, which is a very silent group that you probably won't find if you even look for it on the web. But we do exist, and we're working to bring people like Cheri to Maine. And I want to mention a couple of things that we're going to be doing. One of the goals of Cheri being in Maine is to identify and get involved people who are interested in economic human rights. So one of the ways to do that is to have some information on the table there, including an economic bill of rights for the state of Maine that was put together a few years ago. And there's also information about April 4th, Saturday, workshop all day with Cheri talking about developing an action plan. So I encourage you to get information from the table. And we also have a mail and email list. If you're interested in being more active and getting involved with economic human rights issues in the state, I encourage you to sign the email and mailing list. And the idea behind having Cheri here is because there's a lot of serious problems in this country right now. A lot of them are economic. We've recognized it more recently. We've always had these economic problems, but it's getting worse. And people are getting laid off. People are sleeping in their cars. And if you think it's it's just a small-scale problem, there's a recent article in the Lewiston paper about Kylie Terra, the former mayor, who's a single parent. She got laid off from her job. She had health problems. She wound up sleeping in her car this winter. So it's not something that is a few people who have personal problems. It's not an individual problem. It's a social problem. It's a problem of our society having people falling through the cracks on a regular basis. So the idea here is to bring Cheri to talk about economic human rights as a solution to that. And I think Cheri will tell a little bit of her story. My short story for her is she grew up in Minnesota. She became a single parent. She became homeless. She got angry. She figured out ways to address her situations from the framework and perspective of economic human rights. And she's going to come and talk about that now.
You know, I'm at the age where I don't know if I'm hot or I'm cold. And I'm also at the age where I don't know if I can see with or without my glasses. So it's not some kind of nervous twitch. It's, I don't know. It's that age thing. So I first want to start off by thanking the professor and Larry for bringing me here to Maine. You know, my son said to me, I have two sons. I have a young one that you'll see running around the university someplace here, and I have an older one. And my older son keeps asking me why I can't go anyplace warm. I'm currently in Minnesota right now, so I can relate to the whole weather thing. Just when you think it's going to hit spring, another 12 inches or so will dump on us. I did actually get to recently go to someplace warm. I just, because I have a crazy life, I don't live a regular life that whatever regular is for people. I just got back from India. I was in India for 8 days. I swore up and down I would not go because there's too many crazy things going on in my life and all of that kind of thing. But I was invited by the World Court of Women. I've invited by women from Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Mexico, you name it, India, to come and have this dialogue about what's happening in the world and what do we intend to do about it. So I figured I needed to go, that it was my responsibility to go and talk about what's happening in the U.S. And, you know, of course, while I was there, I, you know, gave my report on what I thought was happening in our country and all of those kinds of things, right? Listened to the reports of different women around the table, talking about watching their loved ones being killed in front of them, listening to how things are getting much worse now in Iraq, and actually listening to the tears of another woman crying because of the increase in troops being sent to Afghanistan. And as I was there, you know, I was, you know, crying, you know, every 2 hours or whatever, listening to these various different women around the room. And then the next morning came, and two women from India came running over to me and held my hand and said, "Oh, Cheri, I just want to tell you that we went to the temple last night and we prayed for you because we're really concerned about what's happening in the U.S. And think it's really important that people like yourself continue to do the work that you're doing in the U.S. So needless to say, listening to all these, you know, revolutionary women in the room, being afraid for those of us that are doing organizing in the U.S. was quite an interesting piece of information to gather from the other women that were sitting in that room. And it was interesting because they all wanted to know how we felt about, well, isn't Obama going to, well, for some of the women in the room, is Obama going to save the day? Are we going to be okay now as a country with Obama as our president? And you know, they were very interested in terms of what I thought about that, which I'll get into in a little bit. I think that we're also, you know, every day of my life, I've had both I would say the burden and the privilege of seeing with my own eyes what's happening in different parts of the country, because on any given month, the movement that I'm a part of will send me around the country extensively for a month, or sometimes other parts of the world, and then I'm home, wherever my home happens to be, for a month, intensively working locally. And so I've been able to see a lot of things, and a lot of the things that, of course, are not covered in the media. And I've had, I've seen how horrifying it is at the large numbers of people losing their homes across the entire country. But what was even more appalling to me was the fact that pretty much Katrina was like a passing phase that kind of like happened. And that if people talk about Katrina, they more or less talk about New Orleans, but they don't at all talk about Mississippi. And it's kind of frightening because it was the flood that hit New Orleans, right? But in Mississippi, particularly in Waveland, Mississippi, that was the eye of the hurricane, and that's where 100% damage took place, and everything was destroyed. Every road, every railroad track, every place of employment, every house, you name it. And virtually, there's been an entire blackout in the media. It's 3.5 years later, and less than 20% has been rebuilt. And so, needless to say, of course, the folks in Waveland, Mississippi are greatly concerned because the rest of the country is talking about this foreclosure crisis, and most of them still don't have a place to live after 3.5 years. And the churches, you know, building their, 50 houses at a time, or Habitat Humanity, we're going to need more than that to rebuild from the devastation that took place there. And there's a story, I think, that is pretty symbolic of what I'm beginning to see happen across the country. Christopher, a member of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, he was inside, they don't have shelters, as we know of shelters in some other parts of the country, in Waveland, Mississippi. And so when the hurricane hit, he was staying in a hotel where they would, pay money to be able to stay there a week or whatever. The hurricane hit, and he happened to be sleeping in his bed, when they told everybody to evacuate, right? It's really difficult to evacuate if you don't even have money for gas, have no other way of getting out. You can't just up and evacuate. And so he was sleeping in the hotel, and next thing he knew is he woke up, he put his hands to the side, and realized that it was all water on the sides of his bed. And he immediately went running up to the top of the roof, and now you can tell I'm from Minnesota, roof, of the hotel, frantically running with other members of the hotel. They got on top of the roof, and then they, it was the people that had different kinds of survival skills. He knew how to hot wire a boat that was, little ways down the way, and was able to hot wire that thing, get in the boat, and save some children, and try to and take them to safety and that kind of stuff. And then he finally ran out of time and space and gave the boat to a family so that they could take the boat away to try and save their family. And then he remained there on the top of the roof until the water went down. And, you have to remember that the water went up higher than like the top of the Kmart sign or the Walmart sign. And then after the water went down, then of course, for a moment in time, there was an equality of poverty. Because it didn't matter if you had a $200,000 home or if you were staying at the hotel, pretty much everybody was walking around figuring out how they were going to live for the next 24 hours. And then of course, they began the horrible process, right? for 7 weeks, he didn't even know if one of his children, his child was alive, because there was no way that he could get access to a cell phone or any other forms of communication, because his child lived with his former wife. And then, again, people relied on his survival skills because his morals and values were not in conflict with each other, and he was able to teach people how to just go into Kmart and start taking the food off the shelves in Kmart in order to feed themselves and get the water in order so that they were able to have something to drink and be able to stay alive. And if it wasn't for people like that and his leadership, there would have been, in that particular area of Waveland, a lot more casualties. Well, there's one other gentleman I want to tell you briefly about, and he's actually a soldier from Iraq. And he was on, do they call it leave or furlough, from Iraq. And the hurricane hit. And he happened to be in uniform in the Kmart parking lot, and so immediately everybody came running to him because they just figured, you know, certainly the government has, you know, sent the National Guard in to help us or something. Little did people know that, no, that was not indeed the case, and that he was there by himself as an Iraq vet. And then he had no choice but to begin to save hundreds of families' lives and to deliver a baby and do all of these things. And it was shown for a minute in national news, but he set up Katrinaville in the parking lot of Kmart. But I wish the story would then go on to be that he was given all these awards and acknowledged for his effort, and he's living happily ever after. No, that's not the story. The story is then his family was put into a formaldehyde trailer, and then after they were put into a formaldehyde trailer and they began to get sick, then they were placed in MEMA cottages, and now they were fighting to hold on to their MEMA cottages because the government arbitrarily said that as of March 31st, that everybody that was living in their MEMA cottages had to be out. Because after all, they had 3.5 years to get their lives together. And if you couldn't get your life together after 3.5 years, then that's too bad. It's time to move on. And so the very fight for the basic necessities of life, there's something that all of these human rights violations have in our country. Whether it's the fight for health care, the fight for food, the fight for housing, you name it, is that we live in a country with an abundance. And we have more luxury units that are vacant and abandoned houses across this country than we have homeless food. And every year, over 18,000 people die because they don't have access to health care. Now that's a preventable Katrina. And so it's been over the years that we began to look at different international models and ways of organizing to look at what we were dealing with in this country. And we began to ask, how come it is that in different parts of the world there's what's called human rights documentation? Why are there photographs of people dying because they don't have access to health care? Shouldn't we have the same kind of documentation in a country that can prevent people from dying? To us, that seemed even more criminal. And so we have been about the business over the last 20 years of ensuring that there's not another person that dies because they die because they don't have access to shelter and they freeze to death in the north, or they die because they were denied health care, that we don't begin to call those things human rights violations. And we're up, I wish we were just up against the enemy and the bad guy, but our government is really smart, right? I mean, some people say, you know, if things are that bad in the United States, why isn't there just massive amounts of people taking to the streets? And my response is we have more people in prison here than any place else in the entire world. And we have billions of dollars under the guise of Homeland Security, as far as we're concerned, that have been used to preempt the civil liberties of people in our country. An example of that is that I have now over probably 200 arrests for really horrible, scary things, like trying to house homeless people in this country, or trying to organize demonstrations and speaking out about poverty and homelessness. During the presidential election, many of you probably don't know this, but we organized a large march, once again, as we always do, of poor and homeless people. All of our marches begin with people in wheelchairs, children. My sons are always in the front of the march. You know, really dangerous people, 6-year-olds, that kind of thing. And you know, for the first time, we were met by a new group of police, which, you know, I came to learn later were like a new kind of police that are going through the whole militarization process, where they're dressed in the black ninja outfits, where they have no identity, no ID badges on, nothing like that. So they just all come in and they're all dressed in black, and they can do just about anything they want to you, and nobody can identify who did what. And so what happened in our march is we first arrived and they cut off the sound. And could you imagine that I'm looking at the back of our march. Was anybody at my march in here? Well, you should have been. No. And looking at the back of the march, right? And you see this whole row of like 80 police officers dressed all in black beginning to say like, ho, 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 like in military. And I'm like, oh my God. I mean, we have children and babies and people and that kind of stuff here at the front. And so what they began to do is they tried to incite a riot. They began to just pick out just random people, tase them with tasers, throw them on the ground, pepper spray their faces, all of these kinds of things, and then take them out, right? Well, certainly they must have been guilty of something, right? No, not one of them has been charged for anything. And what's worse than that is that 80 reporters were arrested. So you know that you're at a different stage in your society, that when you no longer can even march or speak out about the conditions, but then when you begin to take away your press and you no longer have freedom of the press, we're really in trouble as a society. And they made a mistake because one of the people that they arrested was Amy Goodman. You know, she was just intervening to find out why they arrested a couple of her reporters that work for her. And the next thing she knew is she found herself being arrested as well. Well, what is this dangerous thing that we're doing? And I think that the real truth about what the dangerous thing that we're doing is that the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign represents hope. And it represents different ideas about how to get ourselves out of this madness. And one of the things is that we've started this whole concept about if you're being foreclosed on, maybe you should just stay in your home. Or if there's abandoned houses in this country and there's homeless people, why don't we just put those two things together? And I think that that is the thing that's far more frightening to the authorities, is that people are beginning to understand that these are their neighbors, their sisters, their brothers, their loved ones, and are beginning to get involved in things that they never thought that they would be involved in before in their life. You know, I had set up a large homeless encampment in Philadelphia one time, and I brought a woman from Sweden and a woman from Brazil to the encampment. The woman from Sweden, she started crying, just bawling at the encampment. And I asked her, I said, you know, why are you crying? And she said, because I can't believe that the people in your country have adjusted to such a lower standard of living. And then I asked the woman from Brazil, from the MST, the landless workers, why she was crying. And she couldn't believe that the people in this country wouldn't just house themselves in the abandoned houses. And that she saw it as only a question of organization. And so it's quite interesting, because you'll ask any poor person on any block, right? First, we're all ashamed to talk about our economic situation, right? Because if we're struggling, right, even though the whole country is like collapsing, we still don't want to tell anybody that we're struggling to pay our mortgage. We're stretching it on our food. We're a healthcare crisis away from disaster. We don't know how we're going to pay our kids' tuition. Our kids are going to grow up and have to be in debt for the rest of their life. Those are the kinds of things that we're scared to tell each other, even though we're in the same sinking ship. So we're beginning to tell each other the importance of talking with each other, starting to care for each other, and begin to take care of each other, and to demand to take our country back and set the priorities in the right direction. So what do I do? So I never asked at 46 years old that I would be running around the country teaching people how to take over abandoned houses or set up encampments, or how to hold sit-ins demanding people get health care, these kinds of things. But it's not enough to just hold political educations. It's not enough to just lobby the halls of Congress, because I think Martin Luther King said it best, that when it's an emergency, it's time to ignore the red lights and be like an ambulance and go through the red light. And that's definitely what time it is right now in history, is it's time to ignore the red lights and to go through it. The other thing that we're having to deal with right now is that I think that a lot of the Obama money is going to be used to create a form of social control, to take a section of the population and feed into the silencing around these issues in an effort to hold on to their money for their green program or their housing program over here or this or whatever. And so we found it necessary to begin to call out some of these people. And so we've come up with a term called the human rights cartel. In other words, freedom fighters for foundation funding. When their whole existence becomes like, how do I pay the rent for me? Or people that are definitely involved in charity programs where they get lots of money for their homeless organization or whatever, and yet won't allow the homeless people living in that living in that shelter to participate in advocacy efforts to end homelessness. Something is really wrong with that, and not just morally, but historically. Because we really believe that history has shown us that when people that are most impacted by the issue are in the forefront of those struggles, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the women's movement, whatever it was, the struggle for a 40-hour work week, you name it, it's when people that have been most impacted are in the forefront of those fights have we ever really created any kind of change. And so we think that there's this beginning unleashing of this new and unsettling force that Dr. King talked about before he was assassinated. And it's alive and well in this country. We're embracing it. We need your help to grow it in Maine, to begin to teach people about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and to teach people that they can't just talk about these rights, that they've got to begin to reclaim them. If we're talking about a right to housing, let's reclaim housing. If we're talking about food, let's reclaim food. If we're talking about health care, let's reclaim health care. And through this, we can keep people alive. We can develop the kind of leaders that need to be developed during this period in history. And we can deal with this new situation. None of us in here have lived in a time where we haven't had a social safety net. And none of us in here know what it's like to live during a period in history where electronics and technology have had profound impact on the entire world. It has fundamentally changed all of society, just like the invention of fire. And if we can't come to grips with developing a different kind of paradigm for moving forward as a people and a society, then we won't win this fight. Thanks for allowing me to speak here today, and now I'd like to take this time and answer some questions. Thank you. Okay, I saw some eyes out here. Yes?
I hate to do this, be the first question, but I think telling our personal stories is really important. I know you told that earlier this morning. In a longer form, maybe you could give us a thumbnail
Of my life?
personal story, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm a formerly homeless mother, and I was homeless in warm Minnesota. And I couldn't get into the city shelters, and if I hadn't one night decided to break into an abandoned, heated government house, I would have froze to death with myself and my son. And we lived in that house for about 9 months, and I began a process of being arrested anywhere up to 3 times on a daily basis. And what the issue was is that I told the city and the state and the federal government that I would go anywhere if they had some other place for me to go. But freezing to death was not an option for me and my son. And so ever since then, I've been teaching people how to engage in what we call this new underground railroad. Teaching people to break the law in order to stay alive all across the country. So that's my short version of my story, you see. Yes, yes.
And have you seen evidences in the people you talked to, or maybe people you checked back with, that they have been using those techniques or the things that you've taught them? I mean, has there been a change in how people...
Yes, very much so. There's the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign sees itself less as like a national organization and more like kind of like a new movement. Like the 60s, they talked about the civil rights movement. We really see this as a movement for economic human rights. And yes, people across the country in both rural and urban areas are using these methods in order to stay alive. Many of them are in very clandestine situations because they can't afford to be public about, you know, the homeless encampments or that takeover houses or whatever. But yes, this is all across America. Yes. Yes.
I have a question. You see on television people being evicted from their homes and whatnot. When you were arrested 2 or 3 times a day, nobody just pulled you out of the house and locked up and just formally evicted you bodily? What? And how are people dealing with that same thing elsewhere against physical force?
I plan to turn the audience to ask this question. No, just kidding. Well, right now, people should be watching. One of the best things that we have now is we have YouTube. So it's really hard to just like make us disappear off the face of the earth, because not only does our country, but the world has an opinion about just having people disappear. And so right now, we're teaching people across the country how to hold on to their properties that they're being foreclosed on. First, we're teaching people how to go in and have demonstrations and stop sheriff sales. And now they've actually stopped sheriff sales in about 2 or 3 different locations in the country, and we're trying to encourage more of that. And what sheriffs are doing is that they're also indirectly slowing down the process as well by having conversations with us to not hire as many staff people to be doing the evicting, to make that the lowest priority in their office, those kinds of things. And then, like I said, some other sheriffs have made the decision that until we deal with this crisis, that they're not going to be in the business of selling people's homes. And in many different areas of the country, it's an elected position. So we really want to encourage people to hold demonstrations at sheriff's offices because it's an elected position. People have to really think about the public relations aspect about being a gun-ho sheriff to sell people's homes when everybody's being foreclosed on. But the second thing is I think we're about ready in Minneapolis to have probably the largest showdown in the country. There's a woman by the name of Rosemary Williams who has lived on her block for 55 years, and she's a grandmother. And we're probably going to have over 200 people from all walks of life and the religious community that are going to refuse to leave that home, and multiple times, and go to jail to save this grandmother's house. And it's already gone, her house has already gone up for sheriff's sales. And some speculator has already bought the house. And he actually offered to rent it to her. But she said no. She's not going anywhere. That is her home. And it was her mother's home before her mother died. And so people should be tuned into that struggle because we hope to spark a lot of other interests in other parts of the country about what to do. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Because there's just within like a 7-block radius of that house is 5 other homes that are also up for foreclosure. And some of those families have already stopped by the house and want to know what they can do. And so hopefully this whole thing is going to spread like wildfire. And so what we've set up, like I said, the Underground Railroad project and these emergency response teams so that we can send out, hundreds of people to various different homes when they get in a situation of the sheriff's department coming out and bodily removing people. Yes?
In our town, our wireless committee is trying to bring broadband. It's a very small town. As recently as last night, elected officials said, because we want it to be egalitarian, we want it, if somebody comes in, we want it to be available to everyone.
That's wonderful.
Or we want to try to have a fund with the grants or somehow pooling money to help people who can't afford it. This one person said, you really think, I'm not really sure that people want help for it. And I just thought, is this something you encounter with people who are not directly affected by economic hardship? Do you sense a lack of compassion and willingness to help, or is there a strong feeling of people, or is it on upper levels of government and the corporate level where they don't care?
Well, I think those people you were describing are disappearing. And it's been a very hard thing to deal with, right? Because I've been used to, for like the first 15 years of my life, dealing with people that had nothing. So like losing something, they were already on the bottom. Now the majority of the people that I'm dealing with have like worked at their place of employment for 18 years, had 2-car garages, a home, And they are just, first they go through the absolute devastation and shame, and they don't want to talk to anybody about it. They were the ones that blamed their neighbors for being irresponsible or somehow not having work ethics. So they're going through a huge, like you were saying, a huge internal, everything about them is totally changing. Their whole worldview, the way that they thought that they were just like safe in America, is totally unraveling. My sister works at a hospital, Abbott Hospital in the Twin Cities, and they laid off 900 people. And many of them would have no relationship to anybody, and they're represented by SEIU. And it was actually in this woman's house that SEIU has now asked me to come and do a presentation for union members who are losing their homes. And so these are folks that are used to a very good standard of living because they had union wages. And now they're trying to figure out, you know, how to live on nothing. But it's really changing now. And I think that the majority of the people in this country, you know, once they see the people, then those stereotypes go away like that. But yeah, I mean, there's still the stereotypes, and the media is really smart about it, right? I mean, because the media just wants to paint poverty as an issue that only impacts African Americans in this country and rides on the history of racism. And paints poor people as people that like drive around in Cadillacs and don't have work ethics, and you know, all of those kinds of things. Don't know how to balance a budget of nothing, those kinds of things. And now that they're realizing, like, oh my God, they were talking about my sister, my uncle, the person that lives next door to me, the person that's you know worked at the hospital for 25 years. So, yeah. What do they say? You can lie to your head, but not to your stomach.
Some say we're only halfway to the bottom.
Yeah.
Or the bottom is, we're not to the middle point of the bottom, and that a lot more people are going to feel the pain.
Oh my God. In the next 2 years, we need to get ready. And I will tell you, I told you so. Because, you know, the high rate of suicides, people that are imploding as opposed to getting angry and getting organized and doing something about it, we've got to turn that stuff around. Got to turn that stuff around. And the only way that we can do that is through people deciding not to be ashamed anymore, realizing that it's a systematic thing. Capitalism is dying. I'm very sorry. It's not coming back. And it's trying to take everybody down in its path. And either we're going to decide what kind of society and world we have, or they're going to decide it for us. And so, and we can't hold on to old models of the way that we do things, right? Wait for somebody to come by on their horse and like save the day. Especially because each one of us knows in each of our towns somebody that is already sinking in that ship. And you know, either they're going to adopt some backward ideas and get on the wrong train and go in the wrong direction, or we're going to have them getting on a train that talks about what your town wants, something that's about taking care of everybody. Yeah.
First of all, I want to ask, is the T-shirt you're wearing available for purchase anywhere?
We're out of them, but the next time around. I mean, you could email us, and we could have somebody get you a shirt. I'll leave.
I'll do that.
And we also have a national conference to end poverty. How dare we talk about ending poverty? A national conference to end poverty in Louisville, Kentucky. The reason why we're holding it in Louisville, Kentucky has a large number of children that have been removed from their mothers because they don't live in adequate housing. And so we think that this is scandalous, and like one of the worst human rights violations in the U.S. is the removal of children solely because they don't live in adequate housing. So instead of providing people with decent, affordable housing, you know, women are having their children taken away from them. And it was during the 60s that we enacted a lot of laws through social welfare. And now all those bad ways of doing things are back. Yeah.
So, but I wanted to talk
Oh.
about the healthcare. That's
Yes, the healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, for me.
HR 676, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, because there was a good program on Frontline Tuesday night called Sick Across America,
Uh-huh.
the uninsured in this country.
Uh-huh.
And they talked about a lot of the things that you talk about. There's a lot of forces that prevent change,
Right.
which are exorbitant doctor salaries, pharmaceutical prices, high administrative costs. And so I guess I was curious what your opinion on where you think that will change in terms of the HR 676. Is it that's going to be the defining change point, or us ourselves informing the people who represent us, which would then lead to that, of the change needed, so that there was one professor from Harvard Medical School who talked about this. It was actually quite refreshing because you know that his salary is really high, and he was talking about all these things that need to change in the healthcare formula. And he said for too long what we've been doing in this country is trying to find a way to get to universal health care, and what he suggests is we should just adopt it as a moral right for people, put it there that we have universal health care, and then filter down and figure out how to reduce, work on reducing the costs and the load and the unreasonableness all the way around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I have to make a pitch for my son's film. It's called Explicit Ills, which is about the healthcare crisis. You can Google it. You can watch the trailer on your computer. And the film is about a little boy that dies because he doesn't get access to medicine. And it's based on, of course, a real story. But I think you're right. Nothing's going to change unless we have the participation and the leadership of people that are impacted by these issues. I mean, we could sit around and debate, the whole healthcare question forever and that kind of stuff. And the thing that's amazed me in the debate is that people that are currently dying now because they don't have access to health care can not be found in any large way on the media, which is just appalling to me. Both myself and my 6-year-old, we don't have health care right now. And in December, I went to the doctors, and I came back with an abnormal pap smear. I had health care for a couple months, so I decided, better go get everything checked. Came back with an abnormal mammogram, came back with abnormal pap smear, and came back with abnormal colonoscopy. And so luckily, immediately they removed the cancerous polyp, and then for everything else, I'm supposed to have follow-up. And I only tell that story because, and those are all preventable things, right? And so can you imagine the millions of people that are running around having no idea? Yeah, we have different places where we can get free mammogram screenings. Okay, so what? You found out there's a lump or something in your breast. Now what are you going to do? And so, yeah, I mean, and it's a very difficult situation too, because one time I was on a plane. I was going to Bolivia for some other conversation or whatever, and I was on the plane with all these doctors that were going to Bolivia to provide health care. And they are such in a difficult situation because they can't really practice medicine. Some doctors are courageous in this country and go ahead and practice medicine at free clinics and different places like that. But most of them, by and large, are afraid of being sued. And so, like in Philadelphia now, they have no maternity clinics left. So I'm not so sure where you're supposed to even have a baby anymore. But yes, something has to be done, and I think part of that's why we say disappear to the poor, is that I think that the answer also is that the majority of the people in this country are wonderful people. They just have no idea what's going on. It's almost like we don't need tanks and machine guns outside our doors, because all we have to do is turn on the television. And that defines our reality to our children. And everybody thinks that everybody lives the life of the rich and the famous and everything is great. Or they'll show the images of starving children in Africa or whatever. But they won't show you Jane, who lives on the next block, that perhaps wouldn't die from breast cancer if she had access to health care. Yes?
Has your organization found certain ways of dealing with the media more effective than others? Approaches? I'm thinking apropos of your son's film and then some of your other comments.
Yes, absolutely. You know, we are the biggest fans of encouraging everybody to become filmmakers and journalists and you name it. And we try to make sure that every place that we go, that we're magnifying whatever we're engaged in with people with cameras and interviewing everybody and doing all of those kinds of things. And it was actually from the Zapatistas that we learned the importance of the internet, because people were having this debate with us like, oh my God, you know, we have this digital divide, and for poor people, they can't afford computers and to be on the computer. And our response, like the Zapatistas, has been like, well, we better figure it out. Because this is 2009, and in order for us to continue to stay on this planet and us to be able to compete with the dangerous forces that we're up against, we better figure out how to be able to communicate. And if they can figure out how to be online anywhere in Chiapas, we can figure out how to get online in Maine. Pardon?
They have better solar exposure.
In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a serious campaign for a guaranteed minimum income. But Martin Luther King endorsed it. George McGovern ran for president with this idea, and then it fell off the political landscape. I'm wondering if that's a high priority in the efforts you're undertaking.
Yes, very much so. That's one of the reasons why we're having this conference, is we're going to have our program and our plan, and you know, people are calling it 70 different kinds of things, but the same kind of concept that you were talking about, and we're going to be very serious about it, whether it's the guaranteed annual income or whether we call it something different. But all we know is our country has an abundance, it's got the wrong priorities, and we're going to develop that plan here, and we're going to go forward with it. And like I said, ours is a little different because we don't just come up with a platform. We organize to take back the basic necessities of life simultaneously. So that's the thing that makes us a little more controversial. It's like we're going down in a boat and we can't wait for somebody to save us. We have to figure out how to stay alive while we try to fight and change the kind of inhumane policies that exist. Yes?
Just one quick question and comment. What I found is in my classes, if you ask the students if the country can afford it, should everyone have certain basic economic human rights, and all the areas you're mentioning, health care, decent jobs, education, food, I find usually 90% of the students say yes. I mean, it's like a no-brainer. Then the fact that it's not part of the political agenda or economic agenda of those with power is revealing. What I wanted to ask you was, it's the opposite of the clandestine or underground kind of approach. What, in terms of like when King, just before he was assassinated, his main thing was the Poor People's March, similar to the 30s March on Washington, where you get huge numbers of people, and we won't be moved, and you go and you camp out, and it's to raise issues and to embarrass the country. I mean, it really, and you see they're real human beings here. I was wondering if that kind of mass campaign is also part of your agenda.
Yes. Actually, we've traced, we retraced that whole Poor People's March, which began in Marks, Mississippi. And if anybody went to Marks, Mississippi today, at least for me, it brings back total tears, because there's not even a plaque in the town in reference to that whole history. And Marks, Mississippi looks 10 times worse now than it did when King was alive. And there's one woman in Marks, Mississippi that has used her own personal house to keep alive the history, and she's been fighting to open it up to a museum or something about the original Poor People's March. And it's, you know, a little teeny house, and she's poor. You know, that's another tangent of mine that I could go off on forever, because it's really interesting in terms of what things we decide to memorialize and remember, and then other things in history, like there's this big amnesia. But secondly, in 2011, speaking of embarrassment, and hopefully everything will go well, there'll be no repeat of history. One of the reasons I went to India is because they wanted to talk to me about having a world court, but this time in the United States. And that for people that they couldn't get in from other parts of the world, that they would be there via satellite. And we would put various different people on trial in this country for human rights violations. And so we intend to hold the World Court in Mississippi. We think, in particular, ground zero of Katrina. And that'll be in 2011. So that's our plan.
Been able to enlist any high-profile people. I was thinking, as you talk, it sounds very much like the kinds of things Cynthia McKinney would support very.
Cynthia McKinney is very much a part of it. And Dennis Halliday, he is the person that resigned from the United Nations after the stuff happening in Iraq. Ramsey Clark, whole host of folks. Well, we'll be extending an invitation to Michelle Obama, and we'll see what happens. And we need all of you. Yeah, I mean, so we just encourage folks. I mean, get involved here locally. Sign up on the sign-up sheet that Larry has going around the room. Yes.
For those of us who aren't able to demonstrate or sit in or to organize marches, are there some small-scale grassroots efforts that we could participate in to support the cause?
Many things. Because, and all parts are just as important. And particularly like art and culture is a really important thing to us. We need as many people to see themselves as human rights monitors. So whether it's going down to your local shelter, going down to your local hospital, you name it, and we want those faces and those stories of people that are being denied the basic necessities of life. And we have a section on our website that's being revamped that's called Faces of the Fallen. And we need as many of those stories as possible. The other thing is that writing songs for this movement, if you're an artist, paintings, you name it. We also have many large events where we need help with the children, whether it's holding your own local economic human rights schools, whether it's holding all-night dance-a-thons on your university to raise funds for this movement, because it would be great to say that all we need is love. No, we need gasoline, plane fare, gas to get from one location to another. And we're beginning to see that kind of stuff happen across the country. I mean, you know, tons of different universities are like, Cheri, we're going to have like a 1930s dance-a-thon to raise money to, try and help go towards some legal fees to stop some of these foreclosures. So there's lots of, you can just bring up the website and get all different kinds of ideas. Or I would encourage you to get together with the local folks in Maine and just like brainstorm and come up with a bunch of ideas. But you should definitely drop your buckets where you are. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we're not going to get it done if we wait for somebody else to do it. This is not a situation where we can just sit on the sidelines and be spectators. Yes?
I wonder if you've heard about this national demonstration that's planned for April 11th?
Which one?
New Way Forward.
New Way
Forward.
A New Way Forward. Tell me.
It was mentioned on Bill Moyer's program when William Greider was on there. And William Greider was basically saying that people at the grassroots need to get out there and start protesting the policies that are being passed that are favoring the large banks and insurance companies. And so this is a grassroots movement, and demonstrations are being planned all over the country on April 11th, and there'll be one in Augusta.
Wonderful.
And there's a person who's organizing and who's brand new to organizing, but he just wants to do this. So
It's the way to do it. August 11th, Augusta. Oh, I'm sorry, April 11th, Augusta.
Augusta, and you can visit the Peace and Justice Center website, peacectr.org, if you want to learn more.
Excellent. Yes?
I believe there's also a demonstration May 30th in Augusta at the State House for single payer.
Right.
May 30th, the State House for Healthcare demonstration. Single payer health. Oh, absolutely, single payer healthcare. If you're not clear about that, no. All right. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.